So welcome everybody, those who have been with us all along, and those who are joining us for the first time, because in terms of the names, I see people certainly who are joining us for the first time. They are the aficionados of law, obviously, because if you join for the first time now, then you must have a law interest, given our two wonderful speakers. So let me introduce them according to their seniority or old age, or whichever you prefer. Gábor Halmai is a professor of law at the EUI, European University Institute, and is the chair of the Comparative Constitutional Law program there. He has been the director also of the graduate studies of the law department. He has been previously at CEU, at the Utrecht University, which is our co-partner in this project, at Princeton, and I think many other institutions as well. Perhaps even more dramatically, he was in the crucial formative years between 1990 and 1996 at the Constitutional Court as the senior advisor of the president, László Solyom. He has written countless articles on fundamental rights, constitutional jurisprudence, democratic transitions, constitution making, amending, illiberal constitutional regimes, authoritarian backsliding, and so on. I'm going to. I will only mention the books that I know, and I'm sure there are more which I will omit. The Right of Association. I will give the titles in English only, although that I think appeared only in Hungarian in that form. The Freedom of Expression, another, Communication Rights, Constitution. I'm sorry. I have to translate for my own notes. Constitution, Human Rights, Globalization, and the Migration of Constitutional Ideas is a more recent product. Perspectives on Global Constitutionalism seems to be the most recent still. Paul Blokker, our second speaker, is associate professor. If you are still associate, I think that's what all the Wikipedia emails and internet sources say, of sociology in the Department of Sociology and Economic Law at the University of Bologna. Until recently, he was associate professor and Jean Monnet chair of European Political Sociology and program director of sociology in the European context at the Institute of Sociological Studies at Charles University in Prague. He has written many articles on the new democracy and populism, populist constitutionalism, sociological constitutionalism. She edited a volume, Constitutions and Constitutionalism in the EU, the politics of European enlargement, constitutional reform in the EU, and so on. His books, again, the ones which are known to me, and I am sure I'm omitting something from the list, are Multiple Democracies in Europe, Political Culture of the New Member States, New Democracies in Crisis, a comparative constitutional study of Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and Slovakia, and Constitutional Acceleration in the European Union and Beyond, which he co-edited. He co-edited a volume on sociological constitutionalism. So as you see, we have two very distinguished and accomplished scholars. And of course, as our topic, which is populism and constitutionalism, those both have published extensively on these matters. The fact that they don't fully agree on all aspects of it is all the more exciting for us. So we can have two friendly and cooperative lecturers who nevertheless are going to present us somewhat contrasting views on the subject. They agreed among themselves that Gábor or Professor Halmai will start, and Paul or Professor Blokker will then continue, and we'll have a discussion after both of their presentations. So Gábor, Professor Halmai, both are dear friends, and I will stay on first name basis. Please, Gábor, start us.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this kind invite. It's a pleasure and honor to be here among many known faces, and among those also with whom we recently had a course on almost the same topic at EUI with Andrew, Paul, and one of my fourth-year researcher, Julian Scholtes at EUI. And the course demonstrated that certainly at least three of us have three different views on the topic, but this doesn't matter, I guess, to discuss these issues. Let me share my screen and try to present. Okay, so my aim with this short presentation is to find out whether there is such a thing as populist constitutionalism. In other words, we can combine the two terms of populism and constitutionalism. In order to answer this question, I need certain types of definitions, because in my view, the answer to the question depends very much how we define populism and how we define constitutionalism. Very quickly about the variations of populism, I'm sure that this has been the topic in the previous lectures in the series and will be the topics, but let me give you my take on those varieties. The very usual differentiation, which I do not necessarily share, but certainly this is the most common differentiation between leftist and rightist populism. The leftist being more a kind of simplification of economic reality, while the rightist is rather a kind of nationalist approach, mostly with authoritarian pursuits by those, especially in government. I do not want to go into the details. Maybe we will have some dispute with Andrew on that, but certainly to the leftist approach, Southern European countries is parties like Podemos in Spain or Syriza in Greece belong to this group of leftist populists. In Latin America, obviously, the late President Chavez and his successor Maduro in Venezuela, or Morales in Bolivia, belongs to this category. And in the US, although there can be a lot of discussion about that, in my view, Bernie Sanders represents this kind of leftist populism. Usually, those leftists do not really threaten constitutional ideas, constitutionalism, with the exceptions of some in Latin America. Obviously, nowadays, President Maduro belongs to the most important threats to constitutionalism. On the rightist side, in Western Europe, I would say most of those populists are in opposition. In France or in the Netherlands or in Germany, one can argue that the Austrian Chancellor Kurz belongs to a kind of populist approach, but this is certainly not an undisputed categorization. The former President Trump has gone, but certainly the GOP remained in place and can be considered as an influential populist force in the US. Here, as opposed to the leftist version, the threat to constitutionalism is more frequent than on the left side, although again, the left also has certain autocrats. Therefore, I would conclude that this categorization of left-right populism is probably not the most useful one. So let me turn to the very definition of populism, which maybe helps me to define the relationship with constitutionalism. Let me start by someone who of course wasn't an expert in populism, but in 1967, if I remember correctly, at a conference at LSE, he formulated something which in my view very much summarizes what I'm willing to say about those categories of populism and definitions. Namely, Isaiah Berlin said that there are certain false approaches to populism which use the approach of populism, the usual approach, namely this differentiation between the corrupt elite and the people as a rhetorical tool. While those who are really referring to the people can be called as real populist. I come back to this differentiation of Berlin later on. All the others who are listed here, and I do not want to really go through this list. Certainly one of the most influential academics, Jan Werner Müller from Princeton, whose book from 2016 actually argued that the main characteristic of populism is anti-pluralism. The same can be told by others. And let me finish by our co-lecturer, Paul, who actually somehow represents an opposite idea or approach to populism, namely, but he will certainly elaborate on that, claiming that actually populism is democratic, although it's not necessarily liberal. On the other hand, it very much can be considered as a kind of critique of liberalism. Let me turn to the already mentioned authoritarian populist rhetoric, as Berlin emphasized the false character of that kind of populist who are using the people as a kind of pretext for their authoritarian pursuits to fulfill. And let me tell the story of Viktor Orbán, the Hungarian prime minister, who is very often accused of being a populist, even though, and this is my main argument in the case of Hungarian governments or Fidesz's populism, or rather against its real populism. So if you consider direct democracy as one of the characteristics of populist claims, the Orban government from the very beginning was very much against any kind of direct democracy. They were the first who changed the law on referendum, making it even more difficult to trigger any kind of referendum. The other characteristic of populism usually is anti-establishment. The Orban government is anything but anti-establishment. They are very much emphasizing their own establishment and their own representative system, which is another anti-populist kind of approach, because the Orban government very much builds on representative democracy and the gain of 2/3 majority in Hungary. Of course, what makes distinct from non-populist autocrats to autocrats who are non-populist is the democratic election. So certainly the 2010 Hungarian election was a democratic election, although the 2 consecutive elections cannot be necessarily called as democratic. Okay, let me turn to constitutionalism. Again, I claimed in the very beginning that my final judgment on the relationship between populism and constitutionalism very much depends on the definition of constitutionalism as well. So in my view, 2 very important elements of constitutional approaches are political and popular constitutionalism. Political constitutionalism, many representatives of them are listed here, from my former colleague at EUI, Richard Bellamy, through Mark Tashnet or other proponents of weak judicial review, who argue that actually in a constitutional system which uses political constitutionalism, the final word should be not on the judiciary. Same ideas are expressed by Robert Post or Eva Siegel from Yale, who actually uses the term democratic constitutionalism, which also emphasizes the role of courts acknowledging the actual will of the people. The other category, which is also inconsistent with the original idea of liberal democratic constitutionalism, in my view, is the popular constitutionalism. So partly the Swiss direct democratic approach, which uses really the toolkits of direct democracy, mostly referendum and other tools, as means for fulfilling constitutional ideals. And the other 2 main examples in recent years was the Icelandic attempt to make a new constitution, even though the attempt has been failed formally, since the this constitution has not been amended or enacted in a way it was imagined by those popular constitutionalists, but it was certainly a very, very powerful attempt to use this kind of sorry, I should go back for the very last point. Also, the Irish constitution making process, although it's less direct constitution making, but certainly during the referendum on abortion represented a lot of popular elements in the constitutional setting. Okay, so let me turn to the very idea of liberal democratic constitutionalism, which certainly something which should include all the elements of constitutionalism, and can include also the elements of the mentioned popular constitutionalist approaches. I do not want to go into all the details, but in my view, there are three main elements or types of executive accountability or limited government as one of the main characteristics of liberal constitutionalism. Is on the one hand a kind of vertical accountability, namely the electoral laws, free and fair election. The more horizontal one is the institutional setting of checks and balances, both externally and internally. Externally, I mean against transnational institutions, in the case of Europe towards the European Union. And the third element of this accountability is a kind of diagonal one, a kind of public discourse with civil society organizations, a kind of accountable measure for governments. There are certainly many attacks on these approach of liberal democratic constitutionalism, and the formally described more right-wing nationalistic populist attacks are always arguing that the weakening of those elements of liberal constitutionalism, the weakening of the government, the executive, is an attack on the idea of the state's unity, the nation's unity, especially in the situation like the current or other crises, the current pandemic crisis or other crises, where the unity of the nation and a strong government is essential. Of course, on the other hand, there are democratic attacks against the traditional liberal democratic constitutional ideas, and I guess that Paul will talk about that, whether the so-called legal constitutionalism or the dominance of legal constitutionalism as opposed to the mentioned political constitutionalism undermines the democratic character of liberal democracy. And let me go to the final slide and come to my conclusion, and trying to answer the original question I posed in the very beginning of this presentation, whether there is such a thing as populist constitutionalism. As I said, it depends on the definition both. So if populism, which is certainly critical towards oligarchic elites, can be in compliance with constitutional ideas, as long as this populism is not anti-populist, as Jan Werner Müller mostly characterizes populism. In my view, this characterization applies to the autocratic, nationalistic approach of populism, which, according to Iser Berlin, is not a real but a fake populist approach, mostly using populist rhetoric as a pretext. And on the other side, constitutionalism, which is, in my view, per definitionem, liberal democratic, but it does not mean that this constitutionalism should not be and cannot be critical towards certain elements of traditional liberalism, especially towards extreme individualism or against neoliberal economic policy. In other words, in order to somehow connect populism and constitutionalism, as a recent book which will be published very soon by Mark Tashnet and Bojan Bugaric argues, actually we maybe need not only a reinterpretation of populism, as I try to elaborate in my presentation, but maybe there is a need for a reinterpretation of political liberalism, going beyond the traditional elements of limiting government and preventing arbitrariness of that government, but also guarantee freedom from interference and from domination. So there can be and should be a Republican aspect of that newly interpreted liberalism as well. So this is my take on the topic, and thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, so Paul, please, your second.
Just a minute. Okay. I hope you can see the slides, which are going to support me in my presentation, which is going to be indeed a bit different, which is good, I think, and showing in a way that we get to this topic from a different background. Indeed, as Andrew already said in the presentation, I'm coming from a political science and a sociology background. And I mean, in many ways, I'm interested in what we tend to call populism in a broader perspective of, let's call it something like post-communist transformation in the case of Central and Eastern Europe, but also in the case of Western Europe, and that already hints at the fact that I will mostly be speaking about the European context, as some kind of populism, as some kind of indication that something is not working in existing democratic societies. So in some ways, much of what I'm going to say should perhaps be seen as coming from some kind of more agnostic position. I mean, something struck me in what Gábor said. He said at a certain stage, popular constitutionalism has nothing to do with populism. But I wonder if that makes sense if we look at populism as one way of making claims around an abstract notion of popular sovereignty. And well, I will come back to that in a second. So my argument is basically structured as follows. I will give a brief introduction so you have a bit of an understanding of what kind of a direction I want to go. And then I just want to, in a way, sort of unpack different dimensions of relations between populism and, let's call it, public law. So more generally, populism and law, and I will mostly speak about a critical dimension, which I think also came through in Gábor's talk, a critical position of populism towards certain legal liberal structures. But I think there's also a more constructive dimension to populism, where it basically uses law for a different set of projects. And next to that, I would also very briefly like to talk about the notion of the rule of law. And this is particularly also because I'm part of a project, a European research project, which is very much about the sort of idea that the EU should defend a specific view on the rule of law. And populists have a very specific standing there, I think, and it's interesting to explore that part as well. And so that in many ways, it relates more to a European, an external dimension to national populist projects. And then finally, we'll finally get to the real topic I was asked to talk about, and that is the relation between populism and constitutionalism. And also there, I think there's a critical dimension to populist projects, but there's also a more constructive one. And it's important to distinguish these two, perhaps. To be very clear about it, and that's also why I put this picture on this slide, what I'm going to talk about is mostly, if not exclusively, what one could call right-wing populism. And so you see a whole bunch of these types of parties throughout Europe. And it's good to see it in this way, in a way, because one of the things I would like to argue is that I think there are important ideational, ideological linkages between Eastern and Western Europe in this regard. And I think it's an important part of our sort of an analytical scrutiny of indeed right-wing populism. There are many important, I think, at least let's call them ideological affinities between a Salvini, a Le Pen, Thierry Baudet in the Netherlands, and the things that Orban and Kaczynski, for instance, try to pull off in Poland and Hungary. The core of the argument then really is that, in my view, the legal parts of these right-wing populist projects are in many ways constructed as some kind of critique or reaction to what is perceived as, let's call it, an over-juridified version of democracy. I call it here liberal legalism, and in some recent work I talked about embedded constitutional democracy, by which it really mostly referred to the European context, which is in some ways unique, I think, because it is about a longer-term project which includes national constitutional systems, but they are embedded in a much larger set of systems, which includes the European Convention on Human Rights, European Union as a project of integration. And so you can hardly see these countries as islands in that sense. And in my view, the right-wing populism is also a reaction to that part, to a kind of international liberal legal project of democracy. But there's also another dimension, I think, that is really important. That is what I tend to call here conservatism. And there is an emerging literature on this part of the story, the conservative position, also with regard to the law, as I would like to argue. And so I think it's important to start from the idea that the way populism relates to democracy, to constitutionalism, should take into account that democracy is, modern democracy, I mean, is always a balancing act between a more, let's call it institutional project of stability, of legality, and the notion of, indeed, let's call it constitutionalism on the one hand, and on the other, it is based on some kind of notion of popular sovereignty, some kind of understanding of the people rules in one way or the other. And this is always fragile one way or the other. Later, I will briefly mention Eisenstadt, who I think made that point most interestingly, but a lot of other people have made that point as well. And that's an important starting point we should make. But the interesting part is perhaps that at least in some forms of right-wing populism, it criticizes the liberal legal project for ignoring that popular sovereign part. But then, as we will see in some of my examples as well, the way it then promotes its own institutional project, and Gábor also hinted at that, has very little to do, I think, with a robust way of institutionalizing popular sovereignty, if understood in more pluralistic democratic terms. It tends to build projects around very closed unitary collectivist visions of popular sovereignty. And that is perhaps one of its biggest problems. And it also shows, I think, and I won't talk about it in this presentation, but it shows one of the biggest differences between at least some of the right-wing populist projects in constitutional terms and many of the left-wing projects, at least in the European context, where you don't find that kind of collectivist unitary view of the people as the basis of popular sovereignty. And this is, by the way, just a couple of, maybe this is confusing, but I couldn't help myself. This is part of some research I'm working on. And part of what we're trying to do there is to find different justificatory basis for democracy. And so I think one could understand right-wing populism as putting an enormously strong emphasis on popular sovereignty in this collectivist understanding. But in that way, it is strongly in tension with other justificatory notions for democracy, including, indeed, most importantly, perhaps, I call it here protection, but it of course includes all kinds of forms of legal human rights instruments to protect individuals and groups, and also a notion of pluralism as a justificatory basis of democracy. The rule of law part is here perhaps less relevant, but we'll come back to that later. So what I'm interested in is the relation between populism and law, public law in particular, of course. And I think one important starting point is, and I've been getting to this increasingly by looking at different programs, and mostly looking, I have to admit, at, let's say, the ideational part, literally political programs, political statements, and that kind of stuff. And it seems to me that, at least in the European context, but I think similar cases could be made elsewhere, there's a strong conservative component here. And that also brings us back in a way to a kind of more dualist reading of what you could call in broad terms modernity. So if the liberal constitutional project is closer to a kind of, indeed, what is called here an optimistic enlightenment idea of the malleability of the, let's say, the engineering of society, then the conservative, let's say, more romantically inspired understanding of modernity is very skeptical with regard to such rational formatting of society, so to speak. So it puts much more emphasis on authentic communities, spontaneous social ties, etc. And it also means that this type of conservative dimension, perhaps even reactionary, relates to a vision of society that is societal, indeed, spontaneously based on traditions, etc., which is a kind of perfect, harmonious ideal. And it makes me think also of much of Shmuel Eisenstadt's later work, which I think I have to get back to more, not today probably, but in the future, because I think it gives us important insights into how certain parts of right-wing populism seem to be functioning and thinking in many ways. So my argument would be it's extremely important to try to scrutinize, to analyze these relations between populism and law, and to unpack in a way, these populist discourses. And that's why I use these various notions of conservatism and also the sort of the main enemy of populist, right-wing populist views, identified in a way as liberalism, political liberalism, and what you could call liberal legalism, or there are many different takes on that, but they seem to be boiling down to a similar view. And so conservative right-wing populists then see liberalism, liberal legalism as problematic, as a project that transforms society into something that these right-wing populists do not like, which they don't, which they see as a threat to their position on society. And it has a lot to do with traditions, historical roots, and things like that. I call it also here the European way of life. That's often a slogan used by people that criticize migration, Islam, etc. And so I've called that in earlier work, some of the attitudes of these right-wing conservative populists, then you could refer to as a kind of legal skepticism, or I've also called it legal resentment. And I don't mean by that a complete denial of modern law, etc., but a particular critique on a liberal legal spirit, let's say, to law, to constitutionalism, to individual human rights, to the notion of the rule of law in the liberal sense, which is one amongst others. And the main critique is in a way, and then I come back again to this idea of the sort of the balancing act that democracy is engaging in between constitutionalism and popular sovereignty. The argument is democracy has become too juridified, too much, well, in the most outspoken versions, like I looked into Béla Pókol's work recently, one of the Hungarian Constitutional Court judges. And of course, he is criticizing strongly juristocracy, but that might be a more radical position in this regard. Another interesting name there is a figure there is in the Polish context, Ryszard Legutko. I'm basically showing some of his remarks here, some of them coming from the book here on the right, The Demon in Democracy, where indeed the main enemy is portrayed as being liberalism, as a threat to custom, traditions, human nature even. And indeed, he talks also about an imperfect balance where democracy is too much about liberalism, understood as, in a way, as an obstacle to popular sovereignty. And it's also interesting that indeed the European Union is there being strongly attacked as promoting a kind of liberal democratic project that is seen as undermining a different view of a democratic society. Here's another person, although some of you will know much better than I do, who puts it in much more, I would say, simpler language than Legutko does it, attacking the liberals as a kind of sect almost that tries to undermine true Hungarianness or whatever you want to call it. And so it seems to me that this is a recurrent argument. It is a critical stance towards liberalism, towards liberal legalism. And so liberalism then, and including its legal toolbox, let's call it like that, is portrayed as ideological. There is some kind of conspiracy theory even going on there in some ways, because the argument basically is the neutrality that liberals claim towards the rule of law, towards independent judiciary institutions, towards public reason as executed by those institutions. That neutrality is false, according to this right-wing populist. And it's basically an ideological project, in their view, to promote a specific type of society. On the right here, you see one of these billboards, indeed, against Soros, as we've seen in Hungary, but all over the European landscape in different ways. And so I find that there are many things to say about this, but I find it in certain ways interesting that the critique on liberalism takes this type of guise. A critique on liberalism is actually a minority sort of particular political project with a specific attempt at creating political culture hegemony. And in some ways, then you also find some kind of argument that liberalism is actually achieving the exact opposite of what it promises. Not emancipation, but the formatting of our societies in the name of what is a specific ideology of things like gay rights, etc. And that is, in a way, also, I believe, a fairly scary argument. And of course, it has historical sort of echoes in many ways. Also put here on the slide, I come back to that in a second, a book that came out in Italian from a philosopher who seems to be pretty close to the Lega, and in the past he was closer to the Five-Star Movement, where indeed many of these arguments return. An interesting part, and I will come back to that, is that in this sovereignist manifesto by Paolo Becchi, law is not completely rejected. It's being reused for a different type of political project. And just to give you some of the dimensions, I think, that one can find in this sort of populist interpretation of liberal law in specific, is specific understandings of what liberal law is about. And so one way I've been calling this is the idea of legal fundamentalism. That is indeed, and that's the interesting but also the problematic part of the populist argument. On the one hand, for instance, Legutko says, liberal law thinking is too light. It doesn't have substance. It's only about procedures. It's only about a sort of thin view of society. But on the other hand, that liberal project is changing around the whole of our society. It's invading our society. It is oppressing society by imposing all kinds of human rights for minorities and that kind of ideas. We find this in different ways in different populist projects throughout Europe. Thierry Baudet is making similar statements, and while he's in the upcoming elections next week in the Netherlands, he's doing less well. His friend here on the right, Geert Wilders, or his enemy actually, is probably going to come back again. But also Wilders makes similar arguments, often relating the same, what I call legal fundamentalist type of argument, projecting it on the EU as a larger project with totalitarian overtones. That's the way it's being put by these right-wing populists. And the main argument there is that this liberal project crowds out other views of what democracy and democratic society could be about. But as I said, this was the critical part of the populist view towards particular liberal legal positions, but there are more constructive parts. Whatever we think about them, however much we dislike them, they seem to be part of some kind of political project. And you could slice it up, and I took this from another scholar, and we're together doing a special issue that is coming out somewhere this year, indeed on this conservative dimension. But you could think about it, different dimensions in which these populist projects work. The polity part, where also the constitutional dimension becomes more important. The policy part, where indeed policies like we see in Poland heavily against the right to abortion, against LGBTQI rights, etc. There is a clear thrust in those policies. There's a clear attempt to undo a certain liberal project. And it's also clear in the exact forms of politics that these projects, as I deliberately call them, seem to be taken. Of course, on the one hand, they make a claim for liberalism is riding roughshod over other views of society, but they do the exact thing against liberalism, clearly, in their attacks, as we know, on civil society, on free media, which is now, I think in Hungary, Klub Radio, it's still unsure what will be the outcome, but in Poland now, it seems to be we're close to almost complete domination of the media by the government as well. And And politics takes all kinds of other ways in which it tries to constructively set up a project on a very different understanding of what law and rights are about. There's a slight mistake here on this slide, that doesn't matter. And so briefly, a further issue then with regard to populism and law is this notion of rule of law, which is so crucial to, let's call it the huge conflict between the European Union and particularly the Commission, but of course also European Court of Justice and some of these so-called backsliding countries. And I think it's also interesting to reflect further on that dimension. So you get, let's say, the strong EU rule of law defenders, mostly referring to Article 2 TEU, etc., as claiming that there's one idea of the rule of law in Europe, and then people like Varga and many others claim, no, that's not the case. The rule of law is rooted in the domestic context. We can't accept some kind of one-size-fits-all understanding of the rule of law. And we don't only see that in Hungary or Poland, we see this in different guises throughout Europe. I mentioned Thierry Baudet of the Forum for Democracy in the Netherlands. And by the way, the éminence grise behind many of these ideas seems to me the late Roger Scruton, who often pops up as an important intellectual source of inspiration. That's the case in Thierry Baudet in the Netherlands, but here we also see the Alternative für Deutschland, which is under scrutiny currently as being a threat to German democracy, as you might know. And one of their responses is that they are actually the defenders of the German basic law, the Grundgesetz. And so here you see another version, in a way, of a defense of a kind of domestic understanding of the constitution, of the rule of law. And as I said before, I don't have time today to do this in a systematic manner, but these types of arguments pops up in all these various Western and Central and Eastern European right-wing populist movements. So getting to the core of the argument, and that is perhaps what we're most interested in, the relation between populism and constitutionalism. Well, as we, I think, know, the core, the mainstream argument is, and I'm happy that Gábor is becoming more and more nuanced in his position, as he also did at the end of his talk today. But the core argument amongst most legal scholars in particular, but also political scientists, is constitutionalism is the exact opposite of populism. And also here you see a book that's coming out soon. I think the title reflects this as well. Rule of law versus majoritarian democracy, which is actually different. I find it a bit peculiar, by the way, this title, but we can leave that for the Q&A. And I have a problem with putting things in such stark terms. I think it's analytically unhelpful, even if it's politically perhaps very much defensible. And so I would call this the kind of anti-populist position, which sees constitutionalism as the exact opposite of populism, is unhelpful because I think it papers over a number of things. It doesn't really help us much in the longer term historical explanation of the populist phenomenon. It doesn't really help us understand the great varieties that are around there, as Gábor mentioned. And also I was this morning in another webinar with indeed Bojan Bugaric, who makes this argument pretty strongly. But I think the most problematic part is the argument is there's nothing wrong with the liberal rule of law project. There's nothing wrong with specific understandings of European integration through law. And I wonder if that's entirely true, particularly if we also start relating it, as people did in this other webinar this morning, relating it to economic dimensions and put into the mix neoliberalism, which I'm not able to do today. And so I think it's helpful to be to try to be in a way more more analytical in a sense, rather than purely normative. putting populism against constitutionalism. And here I'm not sure if Andrew is happy about it, but here I'm using very briefly his extensive definition of what populism is, and I tend to agree, I guess, completely with it. But as he has always also done himself, I think it might be useful to highlight some of these dimensions further, and that's what I do at the bottom end of the slide. That is, populism as about some kind of critical attitude towards liberalism, and in some ways legal liberalism, and this dimension of constituent power, which is equally highly interesting, I think, even if it's not always coming to the fore in very explicit terms. Depending also, and that's what I put on the left of the slide, depending on in what stage, and I also borrowed this, by the way, from Andrew, in what stage populism is actually in. And so there seems to be some kind of correlation between populism in power, in government, and actual sort of constituent types of politics. And so coming back again then to this notion of a balancing act, it seems to me that at least in the European context, one could speak about some kind of post-Second World War understanding of democracy in different guises, in lo Stato di diritto or la democrazia costituzionale in the Italian context, constitutional democracy and others, etc. But there seems to be, in my view, a democratic project after 1945 that puts a strong emphasis on the juridical part. And it seems to me, as I said before, that the right-wing populists are reacting to that one on different levels, but including, importantly, the international level, the interdependent level, which I find equally very interesting. And one of the issues is there, which is extremely important, I think, is the way it sometimes takes a backlash against institutions like the European Court of Human Rights, which again, I won't be able to flesh out in this presentation, but I think it's an important dimension to keep in mind. And the populist reaction then is, and there I fully agree, I think Gábor says similar things, is highly problematic because it might be in its critique interesting in some ways, even if it's sometimes really blunt, as I showed in some of the remarks before, but it goes in the opposite direction. And so it completely subjects notions of the law to an almost unrestrained understanding of a kind of majoritarian understanding of popular sovereignty. And well, we know many of the examples. One of the things that strikes me there, if, for instance, if you take the Polish case, this didn't fall out of the blue sky. In my reading, actually, I think with the benefit of the hindsight, of course, you could see some of the conservative right-wing tendencies out there right from the start, even if they started radicalizing from the early 2000s onwards. And so here you see, for instance, the Law and Justice program for 2005, on the right from the same year, its constitutional project for a fourth republic. And so a constituent project, you might call it, against the Third Republic, exactly because the Third Republic is seen as a kind of based on a problematic collaboration between liberal and post-communist forces, post-communist in the sense of former Communist Party forces. And so populism is then definitely in contrast to liberal constitutionalism, but it's also about some kind of construction of a different constitutional order. And to immediately preempt critique that we can't use the notion constitutionalism here, well, I might be agreeing there in normative terms, but I tend to use the notion of constitutionalism in what you could call a more sociological sense. That is, as I also do in this book with Chris Thornhill on sociological constitutionalism, the observation there is in modern societies, constitutions have become peculiarly central to the societal project. You could make that argument for the liberal constitutional project, and that's, I guess, my argument around populist constitutionalism. It's pretty central to the populist project too. So in that sense, it seems to me a form of constitutionalism as a constituent societal project. That doesn't mean that the normative critique doesn't hold. These are just different takes, in my view, on what constitutionalism means. And so just to make the case, indeed, that you can see that in the Polish context, you can see it in certain ways, of course, in the Hungarian context, but you see throughout different of these right-wing populist manifestations. Here's the Marine Le Pen's pamphlet for the presidential campaign in 2017, where she had a separate pamphlet, not much talked about révision constitutionnelle, going into some of those directions against liberal constitutional views, emphasizing identity, that kind of stuff. Baudet has made similar arguments in the Dutch case. Here's the German case again, the Alternative für Deutschland, where, well, now they're defending the constitution. We've seen Grundgesetz because they fear that they're going to be abolished because of the militant democratic dimension of German democracy. Apparently, it's not the case. I read recently, but they made claims around defending the German constitution already in earlier years. In their case, it's not really a separate project. It's a different interpretation of what the German constitution is actually about. And it's definitely anti-European. It's definitely anti this international liberal project, if we want to call it like that. And here you have another interesting manifestation. I already mentioned Paolo Becchi, the Sovereignist Manifesto. And again, you see here a claim towards using the law in a different way, a charter for the rights of peoples in the European context. So collectivist interpretation of rights, people's rights, not individual human rights, is the basis of this type of sovereigntist project. I need to wind up time-wise, and I got to the final slide, so that's felicitous, just to try to get some clarity in what I tried to say. Indeed, so you could then, I suppose in this more sociological sense, identify two different projects here around forms of constitution making, etc. The liberal legal one with important international dimensions, with a specific liberal take on what the rule of law, of what human rights are, what judicial institutions are about. And then a populist one, where in many ways, of course, the legal dimensions become of a second order in a way, because it's the popular sovereignty dimension that supposedly takes front seat, so to speak. So, well, that brings me indeed to the end, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Paul. We have pretty close to an hour for the discussion, which is great. And I have seen already the hand of Professor Jean Cohen first. And so you go first, and then I will call on people as I see them.
Yeah, well, thank you both for two interesting talks, and very interesting talks. And I kind of think that I would argue that they're actually very close to each other. And I'm just going to highlight what I think is, well, what I would disagree with. So the distinction between left and right populism that Gábor gave us, and the claim that that only in exceptional cases, Venezuela and what was the other one? Ecuador, does left-wing populism become authoritarian? I mean, how would you know? Because in the other cases, they didn't come into power, not really. Except Syriza did, but I would argue that Syriza abandoned populism, or surpassed, however you pronounce his name. So that's the first point. I don't see the populism that the left and right, supposedly left and right, have in common. I would contend, and of course, Andrew and I just did a book together on this, does have authoritarian logics, in part along the lines that Jan Werner Müller articulated, but also in part in terms of the definition that Paul himself adopted from one of Andrew's papers. So I would argue that. I would also argue that the reinterpretation of liberalism in terms of adding the Republican dimension that Gábor proposed wouldn't work insofar as he insists on non-interference, because the Republican, at least the neo-Republican conception, from Pettit to Skinner to everybody else, is precisely targeting that. So, and I would also argue that Rawls already did that reinterpretation. So I'm not quite sure where that would go, but I think that in effect, you yourselves, and this gets me to Blokker, make the case, malgré vous, that about the logic of authoritarianism implicit in populism that makes itself very clear once it's in power, once it's in the government, certainly when it is the government. And the way you do that is that, of course, what populism critiques, they could be quite right about. Neoliberalism, neoliberal globalization, too much, I mean, I'm American, too much power in the hands of the courts, that's for sure. We have a horrible design, juristocracy, problems with the EU. But I would suggest that the problems with the EU are not its liberalism or its legalism, but that it as a structure, of course, you all know this is the famous democracy deficit, but in order to be able to say that, you don't have to go for populism or the popular sovereignty thing. In other words, Paul, you left us with two alternatives, populist constitutionalism or liberal legalism, but you really didn't give an account. What is liberal democratic constitutionalism? What is liberal democracy? You can't just reduce it to liberal. Now, I agree the tension between popular sovereignty and some version of legalism or whatever a constitutionalism is there. I think that's quite central. But I don't think you can call democratic any structure that institutionalizes only one side. And of course, you show that the populists would go to the opposite extreme. So what would be the third possibility? You would have to have, as it were, liberal democratic constitutionalism. But of course, defined or understood ideotypically as something other than juristocracy, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll stop there.
Okay. I guess let's, for a while, responses one by one, and then if we are running out of time, I will collect questions. So please, Gábor, Paul, whoever wants to go first.
Yes, I'm happy to start. So thank you, Jane, and hello to you. So you addressed two questions to me. The first is about left-wing populism in Latin America. So do not make any mistake. I did not say a word about other left-wing populists in Latin America. I did say only those whom I characterize as certainly autocratic, which does not exclude that the others are not autocratic. I did not say that they are democratic. What I and my main conclusion on that was that actually the left-right differentiation of populism does not really help. It's not a useful distinction for me. This was my conclusion. What I would like to more discuss here is the kind of populism, for instance, of Tom Frank, who are arguing more on US, of course, especially the US People's Party in 1890 something, and also with Roosevelt's, FDR's approach as a kind of populist approach. But the more important question is this second question, whether the reinterpretation of liberalism anyhow helps. My main claim here was, and this is in a way opposite to Paul's approach, who was talking about right-wing populists as a legitimate critique of liberal democracy. In my view, and this is my main conclusion about all right-wing populism, at least in East Central Europe, Hungary, Poland, but also, I mean, Marine Le Pen's manifesto before the presidential election is a totally authoritarian manifesto. It has nothing to do with populism. It has to do with changing the constitutional system in France, abandoning any kind of liberal democratic checks and balances and so on. So, and this is my main point against Paul's interpretation of populism. So where is popular sovereignty either in the current Hungarian or Polish government's agenda, or Fidesz's or PiS's agenda? Where is popular sovereignty there? I cannot see it. On the other hand, as opposed to Paul's claim of legal resentment, I can see a very strong autocratic legalism working in the Hungarian context. Thank you.
If I can say right away about just step in right away about the pamphlet by Le Pen, I think I don't like Le Pen either, maybe, if I can say it on a personal level. I think it's an exaggeration to say that 2017 document is a full-blown authoritarian pamphlet. That's not true. I mean, there's for instance, a part about direct democracy. There's a story about women's rights. And so it's much more cautious. It doesn't mean that the actual project of Le Pen is perhaps a different one, but that's a different story. But let me get back to the very interesting remarks by Jean Cohen. But I think there's a lot to be debated still about left-wing populism. I mean, unfortunately, I do not necessarily have the expertise based on systematic research, but I wonder to what extent can we see really an extensive authoritarian thrust in a party like Podemos? Or another case I've been making where I do systematic research on the Varoufakis party, you could call it in a way an offshoot of Syriza, right? DiEM25 on the European level, where I'm struck by finding some parts of that movement having a populist dimension to it. I think it's hard to deny it. But at the same time, these people have a very strong interest in a citizen-driven constituent project for a European constitution. There's nothing authoritarian about that part, I feel. And I can make that case very strongly, I think. And I've also, in that case, I have difficulty seeing where that authoritarian streak then is. So I think we, at least empirically, still need to be cautious with regard to claiming that also left-wing populism necessarily has an authoritarian thrust within it. And I wonder also, and you will definitely have a good response to that, I wonder, what is that authoritarian thrust made of? Is it this people as one type of Lefortian view of an absolutism returning into the democratic context? That might be true, and I think some of the Latin American cases bear that out, but there's also, I think, an interesting legal dimension. And exactly what I said about DiEM25 is that at least part of the left-wing movements already since the 70s, I think, have embraced a more liberal human rights type of toolbox, which is an interesting part of the story in its own right, I feel. So I think that logic of authoritarianism, it's interesting to explore that further. What does it exactly consist in? Another thing then, and what you said about the EU, I tend to slightly disagree there, I have to admit. I think a deep problem of the EU is the integration through law project. A good part of the democratic deficit has to do with that. It has also to do with other things like a European Council that's just hijacked by national sovereign states. But there's also a project headed by the Constitutional Court, or by there I make the mistake, the European Court of Justice, which is based on a one-sided usage of law to create a European, I always tend to call it supermarket, or in official terms, a single or internal market. And there are big problems, I think, with using law in these ways to integrate Europe, because it indeed feeds into populist reactions against that project for, in some ways, I think, very good reasons.
Okay, so I think I will suggest this time that I will take two questions, and then let's see how we're doing with those. So who would like to go next? Again, I see only those I see. Well, I do see everybody actually, as far as it goes. So if you raise your actual hand, that works. And Professor Erking, I see the magic hand. So please, Tony, you're next.
I'm the next. Thank you very much. Okay, you hear me. Okay. Thank you so much for the two presentation. It was really very, very interesting and inspiring, and I liked a lot. I can measure how I was interested in what you said, that I have a lot of questions, but I will try to limit my questions. I have two questions. One is a historical history-related question. The other one is a current question, a current problem. So you are talking about constitutionalism as a major principle which characterizes the liberal democratic plural system. I think somehow differently, because according to my knowledge, which is quite limited, constitutions existed in a non-liberal authoritarian regime. Let's start with Stalin. If I know correctly, Stalin ordered the Soviet parliament to elaborate a constitution and to pass it. That became a tradition, because in Hungary, 1949, when the Communist Party was already in power, they also passed such a constitution. So somehow, I'm not sure that the constitutionalism is an independent principle. It's more a kind of tool to formalize the major values of a system, either if an authoritarian system, a totalitarian system, or a democratic system. The opposite is Orban, actually, because what did Orban when he got in power in 2000? Immediately, they ordered the Fidesz to put together a new constitution to eliminate the previous one, which we had a lot of this. We had a lot of discussion with Gábor earlier. I was more critical with the 89th constitution he was defending, and he convinced me that he was fine, because he emphasized that the constitution, not the main positive aspect of a constitution is not necessarily the content. You remember, Gábor, you told me that the stability, and the Constitutional Court, which interpret the constitution, that together should guarantee that Hungary is becoming a new system, a liberal democratic system. So this was one of my empirical comments, that how do you think about this? The second one is a current problem. I really became absolutely upset what happened a few days ago in Brussels, because Brussels, let's say, the church of the liberal democratic principles and rule of law, and these are the basic values of the European Union. What happened then, the European Parliament lifted the immunity of the Spanish or the Catalan former prime minister. You know, it's against everything what could happen in this case. Even the earlier decisions, like the Germans who said that because the main argument by the Spanish government was that the Catalan government was involved in riots to bring a riot in Spain, and the German, I don't know which court, declared that when he was there and detained for a short time, they said that they cannot interpret this whole claim that this category doesn't exist in the German law. Anyway, so it was passed. So what I want to say that the constitution is not so crucial because the European Union, because they followed political interests, everything based on political interest. If the Spanish government cannot stop the Popular Party in Spain to achieve that in the parliament, they could bring such a decision, which is absolutely, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but it's absolutely unacceptable. So is it a serious issue now in Europe if the parliament could come out with such a decision? Which of course they are, you know, the parliament is the major institution of the constitutionalism. These are the two questions. Thank you so much.
Yeah, okay, so maybe we can answer this first because it's a detailed question, has many parts. So please, either Gábor or Paul, whoever wants to address Professor Erking's.
Yes, I'm happy to start again. So thanks, Antal. To the first question. So constitutions and constitutionalism are not the same thing. So of course, the 94 constitution of Hungary or the 36 constitution of the Soviet Union are all constitutions, but have nothing to do with constitutionalism. And Andrew, who is maybe one of the best experts of Hannah Arendt here among us, for sure, Arendt always said constitutions are of freedom, libertatis, constitutional libertatis. Constitutions are for freedom. Those constitutions, neither the Soviet nor the Hungarian 49 are constitutions for freedom. Not to speak about separation of powers or rule of law, but those are having nothing to do with the constitutionalism idea. Second question is more difficult, I guess. I don't like the decision of the European Parliament in the case of Vojemos. On the other hand, from a legal point of view, the reasoning of the decision is very simple. You cannot claim immunity for an act which was prior for your membership in the European Parliament. So it does not work. So immunity is about something you committed while you were a member of the European Parliament, but your immunity defends you against any kind of revenge by an executive or other organs. So the European Parliament simply argued, we cannot deal with this issue. They did not go into the substance of the question, whether the Catalan independence movement is right or not. It just said that this legal instrument of impunity does not work in a case which is prior to your becoming member of this parliament. But of course, I very much agree with you about the political nature of the European Union altogether, and most of the European Union's institutions. By the way, I have to add that the European Parliament is the least political institution among those. The most political institution is the European Council. And here I would like to somehow react to Paul's very last comment on the previous question. So if we are talking about European democracy and the deficit of European democracy on the EU level, it's certainly true, there is a democratic deficit, but actually the European Council is an organ of the member states. It's not a democratic institution in the sense that this represents the member states. And everything which is somehow supporting those undemocratic member states like Hungary and Poland is mostly coming from this European Council, which is not a democratic institution, and which is I don't think that represents anything which is European democracy. Is representing the member states, including those undemocratic or even autocratic member states. Thank you.
Okay, well, I have to admit I found these two questions by Anton particularly complex, although it seems to me that your point on your historical point, in some ways, if I don't understand you, I misunderstand you, to be dovetailing with what I tried to make as an argument in sociological terms. That is, constitutions as something central to the creation of modern societies. Of course, with Stalin's constitution, there's a lot to be discussed there. And I haven't been studying Stalin's constitution in depth, but I remember going through for my PhD thesis, the various versions of the Romanian communist constitution, and I found it in some ways intriguing. The main question there remains, of course, why were these documents adopted? Why were they still in some ways considered important? To me, the argument they were simply facades doesn't hold up, particularly not if you start looking at developments in the 70s and 80s. And luckily, there is now, at least amongst historians, an increasing interest in revisiting the whole notion of socialist legality, etc. There's this really interesting book by, what's his name, Ned Richardson Little on the Eastern German case, which is called something like a human rights dictatorship or so. Indeed, rethinking about what law, rights, legality, constitutionalism meant in those societies. And so in that sense, I think we are in certain ways on similar ground. With regard to the Puigdemont decision of the European Parliament, I'm not sure what to say. I'm not entirely sure if I see the link here with populism. If your argument is that constitutions are not always respected, I think there are more scandalous things going on at the EU level. Think of Advocate General Sharpston's dismissal completely, at least in the reading of Dmitry Kochinov and others who know much more about this than I do, completely against the EU's its own view on the rule of law. Indeed, the fact that constitutions are core to modern projects of society doesn't mean they're not violated in very important ways. So if that was what your argument was about, then I think you have an important point there. And then finally, a bit reacted to Gábor. I agree that the democratic deficit of the EU includes, to a very important level, this really problematic institution of the Council. But that doesn't mean that there aren't important other facets to a democratic deficit that operates on various levels and in various ways that aren't equally a great obstacle to a more democratic European Union, if that's what we want. I mean, I'm not sure to what extent you're following the current conference on the future of Europe story, but there are great problems, I think, with how the EU handles, on the one hand, a civic participation rhetoric, and then actually puts it into practice, which is most of the times almost ridiculous in the way it handles actual forms of civic input. But that's another story in a way.
Only one sentence to the Gábor, because, okay, the both comments, answers were very, very good and very, very interesting. So I'm very happy with this, except what Gábor told about immunity. Okay, that happened. But in Spain, the royal family still have the immunity, even they committed their crime, and it was proved before the recent time. So the royal family, it seems to be forever, they have an immunity, even it happened earlier or now. So there is a kind of contradiction between the Brussels decision and the Spanish parliament's decision. Thank you.
I put myself on the list because we're running out of time, and at least I wanted the chance to ask a question which is primarily political. That is, Gábor already knows where we agree, where we disagree, and Paul, it's more difficult because he's introducing a completely new aspect here concerning the conservative dimension of populism, which I really have to reflect on because it's really interesting. But in any case, the political issues remain clear from point of view of our interests, or at least the political questions remain clear. And let me ask them. You know, I agree, of course, with Jean that it's not just two, but many Latin American populisms in power are authoritarian. The number is in the 20s, 30s, more. So it's a big record, and you don't neglect it. But on the other hand, you know, it has to be said. And Podemos and Syriza come into part of power under extremely strange conditions, which is even true for Five Star, and because they have to be in coalition with one another. So these are not great tests of populism in power. But let's leave the empirical matter, because we can't decide this empirically. In Europe, it's one thing, in Latin America, another. Is the difference based on Europe against Latin America in some historical way? But still, here is the first part of my political question. As political individuals, people who make political judgments, do we fear populism in power? In other words, I do, certainly. Of course, it depends on the definition, but still, with a populism fully in power, I would have fears. And one question is whether you share those fears. And the second question is, and it's the more important one, what to do about them. Paul raised this issue toward the end of his talk. Now, if we agree with Paul, and I do, that in the critical level, populism in opposition raises many points about contemporary democracies that we should take seriously, that we should even agree with on many levels. If that is the case, what is the option that we have politically? Because, you know, if you have Bernie Sanders and Franklin Roosevelt on the list of populists, then you could say, well, left populism is the answer to the danger. If, on the other hand, we have a narrower definition, as Paul was very friendly in citing mine in his presentation, then, of course, Roosevelt and Sanders are not there. And then our question is, what then? What is it that we're going to propose ourselves? And it's difficult because if we share the critique, does that mean that we get implicated in the alternatives that they propose also, which are often presented in an organic relationship to the critiques? And, you know, if indeed we have a narrower definition, are we stuck with left populism, as it has been known in most historical cases, as the answer to populism, or is there something else that we can generate? And how does that thing relate to constitutionalism, which is our topic today? And I must say, it's a difficult project, because even if we agree with Paul that we can't just return to liberal democracy as it was, and I very much agree with that, nevertheless, how much of that liberal democracy would be part of what we ourselves would propose? And how many elements of the populist syndrome as a whole would we adopt? And I think that in a country like Hungary, this will be an important question, because this thing will have to be defeated, right? I mean, we are still imagining that it can be defeated. So what is going to be the programmatic content of our alternative appeal? I mean, if Gergely Karácsony is the candidate, right, I'm not predicting anything, right, for Hungary, but if someone like he's the candidate, is he going to say, well, let's return to the democracy of the Free Democrats? I think he would not be ever foolish enough to say something like that. But people would be tempted. Some of my good friends, I won't mention names, might be tempted to say that. Let's return to the Rawlsian version of the Free Democrats, of the position of the Free Democrats, let's say, I don't know when, in 2000. And if not that, then what? What is it? What would be the components? And I think Paul has a lot of ideas about this, which he sort of implies, and I'm sure that Gábor has too. But in any case, I'm in a bit of a dark politically about what it is that we would propose if we had a chance to seriously propose some program for somebody to do something. So that's really the, unfortunately, too long a question that I'm asking.
Okay, so your first question about the fear. So I have been living in Italy since 2016. You know, the first populist government came to power in 2018. It was a coalition of the Five Star Movement with Salvini's Lega party. Frankly speaking, I'm convinced that Salvini is an autocrat, a would-be autocrat, but I did not have any fear during that 1 year until 2019 when Lega left the government and Partido Democratico entered into the place. Ever since, I have no fear in Italy, and I don't think that everyone could have legitimately serious fears, even though we have a government led by Cinque Stelle as the main governing party. And another reaction to this, and a kind of proof that this left-wing and right-wing differentiation between populist parties does not really help, because I cannot really decide whether Cinque Stelle is a right or a left-wing party, but they are certainly a populist party, openly populist party with certain elements of questionable issues regarding populism. But at the end of the day, I don't think that they threaten the parliamentary democracy in Italy, although they do not like the parliamentary democracy in Italy. And equally, Andrew, I always challenge you to say something about the threat of Syriza and Podemos. I did not see any major threat, neither now Podemos being in the government, even a junior partner, or Syriza, who used to be on the government. So I don't see that threat. Regarding your second question, of course, I do not know the answer. I do know more or less what is not gonna work. What is not gonna work is going back to the neoliberal economic policy of the socialist liberal government, which they still deny, by the way. So they at the very moment they deny that they had any neoliberal politics during that many years they governed. So they do not even realize what they did. And certainly something has to be changed regarding this traditional liberal democratic institutional setting. By the way, I was arguing from the mid-90s onwards that this very strong power of the Constitutional Court is not anymore the approach we should follow. Nowadays, certain people, like the mentioned Judge Pokol, is arguing that I was the first who argued against a very strong judicial review. Yes, I do. I think it was very crucial in the very beginning of the democratic transition, when there was no constitutional culture whatsoever in the country. I don't think that we need a strong constitutional court. We do need an independent constitutional court, which is not the case currently in Hungary. But that strong jurisdiction of the constitutional court is not needed anymore. And many other elements of the original setting of the liberal democratic order in 1890 is not necessarily needed. Thank you.
Thank you. Paul.
Well, it's just great that we're both from the same context, so both living in Florence. I've been living here slightly longer, since 1999. And I have to say, the 2018 green-yellow government, I was scared. And I know a lot of my, let's say, left-leaning friends, including people like Nadia Urbinati, were scared. We were so scared that we actually started mobilizing, setting up a kind of left-wing sort of intellectual think tank because of indeed the autocratic thrust that Salvini showed particularly, but also in the five-star movement. And you can't define it easily because it has all these different dimensions within it, but the right-wing part took over in many ways. And that scared me too. And so in that sense, I fully share what Andrew indicated, that this dimension of populism in power and government can have very problematic dimensions. In Salvini's case, it was in particular with regard to migrants, but also, for instance, with regard to academic freedom. There were great hints that certain things couldn't be said anymore. And a book on the Lega that showed its highly corrupt practices was being, the authors, the academic authors of that book were being threatened by the Lega with legal action, etc. So the first steps were there. That, yeah, in a way, I believe one dimension that might need even further study in this regard is indeed the five-star movement. I mean, funnily enough, recently, Luigi Di Maio, who's still Minister of Foreign Affairs, he claimed now that the five-star movement is liberal within the big grand Draghi coalition. But what is interesting about the five-star, I think, is that when they came to government in 2018, they had two constitutional amendment projects. The first one was the 1/3 reduction of the Italian parliament in terms of parliamentarians. The second one was a much more democratically participatory driven project with extended legislative initiative by citizens, etc. The first one made it, 24 October last year. The second one didn't. And the first one, by the way, in constitutional terms, connected with the Italian electoral law, might have dramatic implications of the Hungarian type. That is, next time we have elections, if there's no new electoral law, it might imply that the whole parliament is basically run by the Lega or by Bologna, the Fratelli d'Italia, which is in some ways even more problematic. So that's something to think about. But I mentioned the 5-star so much because it has in itself these two dimensions of going towards a right-wing populist and fearful direction, and into this other direction, which I would call civic democratic. And that brings me to Andrew's second question about the solution, which I think lies in a combination, and it's a classical question that we've been knowing since the early days of modern democracy, which includes a combination of what I would call the social question, and the second one would be the question of economic democracy. It sounds like we're back to on the Jewish question by Karl Marx in some ways, when he discusses the rights of the citoyen, for instance. And so my view of a solution is a combination of these. That is, you won't know this because I don't think it's published in English, but Nadia Urbinati recently published a book in Italian called the multi-country pochi, or the pochi country multi, which means the few against the many. And that's a critique of oligarchy. And I think it needs to start there. I mean, in my view, both the socioeconomic problem and so with the economic and the social questions and the democratic problem of civic participation starts with the problem of oligarchy. That is, political institutions run by closed political classes using specific instruments to keep hold of power. And so in very broad terms, I think their changes need to be made. But yeah, it doesn't help much perhaps that it is particularly the populists that take up this banner of decrying the oligarchy. And that is a big problem, of course. But as Andrew, I think, knows, and some of others of you might know as well, my hint would be towards a more, what I would call a civic constitutional project, meaning trying to go into the direction of the creation of constitutional orders that allow for pluralistic bottom-up participation. And we don't see much of that around yet. And even the Icelandic case in that sense is, by the way, highly problematic because it didn't lead too much in that direction ultimately.
Thanks. So we have maybe time for one more question. Who wants to, after these very eloquent remarks by the two speakers? So yeah, Agnes, please. Agnes Kavir. Yeah, please, Agnes.
Thank you. I tried to unmute myself. Yeah, I think, thank you very much. Both of the lectures were very exciting. And in a way, I would like to link myself to Andrew's thought about, or reflection on Paul Blokker's, one of Paul Blokker's thought about criticizing the anti-populist position, which interested in restoring a status quo of ex ante, or the past status quo, which cannot be held because of the weaknesses, because of a lot of democratic deficiencies, because of the problems of the liberal project, the neoliberal economic project, and so on and so on. But, and yeah, we try to figure out and try to shape different ideas, how to replace and how to move on, how to somehow, in a way, co-opt, which is not a very bad word from this perspective, co-opt some ideas and some criticism of populism into the next step, into rethinking a democracy and a kind of, who knows what kind of democracy, liberal democracy, I don't know, or civic constitutional democracy, I don't know. But meanwhile, we are thinking about this. There is an incredible process in our countries, including Hungary. The process of reshaping the population, reshaping people's mind, reshaping people's sentiment. It's a kind of very clear way of governmentality, you know, how to create the proper citizen or a bench of proper citizen or proper citizenship, you know, population. And there are a lot of ways, you know, of course, through totally covering or terminating the free media, through what is the most painful, I mean, from my perspective, one of the most painful things is reshaping the public education. And for instance, an example, you know, the Hungarian national basic curriculum, which is applied in the whole public education, and the attack on the higher education at the same time, creates an incredible situation, I think. So I still teach bachelor students. And I see, and I've been teaching them for decades, and I see the change of the attitude, the morale, the expectations, and the mindset of students who get into the university. So for instance, I teach deviance and deviance or diversity or deviance. This is one of my subjects. And in the recent years, when we speak about, for instance, homosexuality, students just react on a totally different way than they reacted several years ago. So they accept discrimination of sexual diversity or homosexual people. They accept in certain ways of nepotism. They accept discrimination. They accept privilegism. So I mean, it is just a kind of harm, and a very, very deep harm that I experience, which is which this whole populist setup achieve and does, still doing. And my question is, yes, we are speaking about where to go, where is how to get out of this situation, and what options we have, but with whom we are going to do with these kind of changes, with whom we are going to do the new constitutionalism in a country where people have no idea what constitutionalism means, and in a country where people know, where people think constitutionalism is something where, for instance, homeless people can be punished because it is included into the constitution, you know? So what kind of, you know, so I think, yeah, these are my concerns and at the same time my question as well. So what do you think, what kind of people will be here at the end of, or in this process, who we can cooperate with? And yeah, you understand maybe my point, I hope. Thank you.
Okay, so the closing words from our speakers.
Yeah, I understood the question addressed to Paul and Andrew, but I fully agree with Agnes, and this is a very sad situation. But I tend to think that, as I said earlier, this has nothing to do with populism. So in a sense, with real populism in the sense of Isaiah Berlin, this has to do with autocratic regimes imposing autocratic thinking. And this has been the case before the democratic transition all over East Central Europe, and it's still the case everywhere in the world where authoritarianism still exists. I don't think that real populism has anything to do with this. I don't think that Thomas Frank's idea of populism or Michael Sandel's approach or Samuel Moyn's approach has anything to do. We have to deal with our autocrats, and this is a hard issue. We cannot solve this problem by fighting real populism, I think.
Yeah, Paul.
Well, yeah, I find your account really important, I have to say. And to add a bit to the pessimism, this is not merely a problem in societies like Hungary or Poland. I mean, things are changing around Europe for sure, and probably beyond Europe. To give you just one example, I come from a country that has been so-called pioneering progressivism for a long time, the Netherlands. But for instance, in the current parliamentary debates and public debate, abortion is again put to discussion. And in the Netherlands, equally, conservative young people are on the rise, so to speak. More and more young people have these types of mindset. So this is a huge problem. I fully agree. And in that sense, from a sociological point of view, it's extremely interesting and worrisome how these trends operate throughout our societies. But it strikes me also, as Gábor said, that in some ways we're back to square one, it seems to me, although I never lived under communism. But again, apparently, there have to be some people that stick out their necks and make claims into a different direction. But I fully agree, it is a very difficult project. But yeah, at least some of us have to jump on to that bandwagon, I suppose.
Well, thank you very much, all the two great speakers and the audience. I really enjoyed and learned from these presentations, and learned also about a little more about your political views about the future. So thank you.